Section 3. The Real Life on the Land. We offer one among many proposals for undoing the evil of capitalism, on the ground that ours is the only one that really is a proposal for undoing it. The others are all proposals for overdoing it. The natural thing to do with a wrong operation is to reverse it. The natural action, when property has fallen into fewer hands, is to restore it to more numerous hands. If 20 men are fishing in a river in such a crowd that their fishing lines all get entangled into one, the normal operation is to disentangle them and sort them out so that each fisherman has his own fishing line. No doubt a collectivist philosopher standing on the bank might point out that the interwoven lines were now practically a net, and might be trailed along by a common effort so as to drag the riverbed. But apart from his scheme being doubtful in practice, it insults the intellectual instincts even in principle. It is not putting things right to take a doubtful advantage of their being wrong, and it does not even sound like a sane design to exaggerate an accident. Socialism is but the completion of the capitalist concentration. Yet that concentration was itself effected blindly, like a blunder. Now, this naturalness in the idea of undoing what was ill done would appeal, I think, to many natural people who feel the long-winded sociological schemes to be quite unnatural. For that reason, I suggest in this section that many ordinary men, landlords and labourers, Tories and radicals, would probably help us in this task if it were separated from party politics and from the pride and pedantry of the intellectuals. But there is another aspect in which the task is both more easy and more difficult. It is more easy because it need not be crushed by complexities of cosmopolitan trade. It is harder because it is a hard life to live apart from them. A distributist for whose work on a little paper defaced, alas, with my own initials, I have a very lively gratitude, once noted a truth often neglected. He said that living on the land was quite a different thing from living by carting things off it. He proved far more lucidly than I could how practical is the difference in economics. But I should like to add here a word about a corresponding distinction in ethics. For the former, it is obvious that most arguments about the inevitable failure of a man growing turnips in Sussex are arguments about his failing to sell them, not about his failing to eat them. Now, as I have already explained, I do not propose to reduce all citizens to one type, and certainly not to one turnip-eater. In a greater or less degree, as circumstances dictated, there would doubtless be people selling turnips to other people. Perhaps even the most ardent turnip-eater would probably sell some turnips to some people. But my meaning will not be clear if it be supposed that no more social simplification is needed than is implied in selling turnips out of a field instead of top hats out of a shop. It seems to me that a great many people would be only too glad to live on the land when they find the only alternative is to starve in the street. And it would surely modify the modern enormity of unemployment if any large number of people were really living on the land, not merely in the sense of sleeping on the land, but of feeding on the land. There will be many who maintain that this would mean a very dull life compared with the excitement of dying in a workhouse in Liverpool, just as there are many who insist that the average woman is made to drudge in the home without asking whether the average man exults in having to drudge in the office. But passing over the fact that we may soon be faced with a problem at least as prosaic as a famine, I do not admit that such a life is necessarily or entirely prosaic. Rustic populations, largely self-supporting, seem to have amused themselves with a great many mythologies and dances and decorative arts, and I am not convinced that the turnip-eater always has a head like a turnip, or that the top hat always covers the brain of a philosopher. But if we look at the problem from the point of view of the community as a whole, we shall note other and not uninteresting things. A system based entirely on the division of labour is in one sense literally half-witted. That is, each performer of half of an operation does really use only half of his wits. It is not a question in the ordinary sense of intellect, and certainly not in the sense of intellectualism, but it is a question of integrity, in the strict sense of the word. The peasant does live, not merely a simple life, but a complete life. It may be very simple in its completeness, but the community is not complete without that completeness. The community is at present very defective because there is not in the core of it any such simple consciousness, any one man who represents the two parties to a contract. Unless there is nowhere a full understanding of the terms self-support, self-control, self-government. He is the only unanimous mob, and the only universal man. He is the one half of the world who does know how the other half lives. Many must have quoted the stately tag from Virgil, which says, "Happy were he who could know the causes of things," without remembering in what context it comes. Many have probably quoted it because the others have quoted it. Many, if left in ignorance to guess whence it comes, would probably guess wrong. Everybody knows that Virgil, like Homer, ventured to describe boldly enough the most secret counsels of the gods. Everybody knows that Virgil, like Dante, took his hero into Tartarus in the labyrinth of the last and lowest foundations of the universe. Everyone knows that he dealt with the fall of Troy in the rise of Rome, with the laws of an empire fitted to rule all the children of men, with the ideals that should stand like stars before men committed to that awful stewardship. Yet it is in none of these connections, in none of these passages, that he makes the curious remark about human happiness consisting in a knowledge of causes. He says it, I fancy, in a pleasantly didactic poem about the rules for keeping bees. Anyhow, it is part of a series of elegant essays on country pursuits, in one sense, indeed trivial, but in another sense almost technical. It is in the midst of these quiet and yet busy things that the great poet suddenly breaks out into the great passage about the happy man who neither kings nor mobs can cow, who, having beheld the root and reason of all things, can even hear under his feet unshaken the roar of the river of hell. And, in saying this, the poet certainly proves once more the two great truths, that a poet is a prophet, and that a prophet is a practical man. Just as his longing for a deliverer of the nations was an unconscious prophecy of Christ, so his criticism of town and country is an unconscious prophecy of the decay that has come on the world through falling away from Christianity. Much may be said about the monstrosity of modern cities. It is easy to see, and perhaps a little too easy to say. I have every sympathy with some wild-haired prophet who should lift up his voice in the streets to proclaim the burden of Brompton in the manner of the burden of Babylon. I will support, to the extent of sixpence, as Carlyle said, any old man with a beard who will wave his arms and call down fire from heaven upon Bayswater. I quite agree that lions will howl in the high places of Paddington, and I am entirely in favour of jackals and vultures rearing their young in the ruins of the Albert Hall. But in these cases, perhaps the prophet is less explicit than the poet. He does not tell us exactly what is wrong with the town, but merely leaves it to our own delicate intuitions to infer from the sudden appearance of wild unicorns trampling down our gardens, or a shower of flaming serpents shooting over our heads through the sky like a flight of arrows, or some such significant detail, that there probably is something wrong. But if we wish in another mood to know intellectually what it is that is wrong with the city, and why it seems to be driving on to dooms quite as unnatural and much more ugly, we shall certainly find it in that profound and piercing irrelevancy of the Latin line. What is wrong with the man in the modern town is that he does not know the causes of things. And this is why, as the poet says, he can be too much dominated by despots and demagogues. He does not know where things come from. He is the type of the cultivated cockney who said he likes milk out of a clean shop and not a dirty cow. The more elaborate is the town organization, the more elaborate even is the town education, the less is he the happy man of Virgil who knows the causes of things. The town civilization simply means the number of shops through which the milk does pass from the cow to the man. In other words, it means the number of opportunities of wasting the milk, of watering the milk, of poisoning the milk, and of swindling the man. If ever he protests against being poisoned or swindled, he will certainly be told that it is no good crying over spilt milk, or, in other words, that it is reactionary sentimentalism to attempt to undo what is done or to restore what is perished. But he does not protest very much, because he cannot. And he cannot because he does not know enough about the causes of things. about the primary forms of property in production, or the points where man is nearest to his natural origins. So far, the fundamental fact is clear enough, and by this time this side of the truth is even fairly familiar. A few people are still ignorant enough to talk about the ignorant peasant, but obviously, in the essential sense, it would be far truer to talk about the ignorant townsman. Even where the townsman is equally well employed, he is not, in this sense, equally well informed. Indeed, we should see this simple fact clearly enough, if it concerned almost anything except the essentials of our life. If a geologist were tapping with a geological hammer on the bricks of a half-built house and telling the bricklayers what the clay was and where it came from, we might think him a nuisance, but we should probably think him a learned nuisance. We might prefer the workman's hammer to the geologist's hammer, but we should admit that there were some things in the geologist's head that did not happen to be in the workman's head. Yet the yokel, or young man from the country, really would know something about the origin of our breakfasts, as does the professor about the origin of our bricks. Should we see a grotesque medieval monster called a pig hung topsy-turvy from a butcher's hook, like a huge bat from a branch, it will be the young man from the country who will soothe our fears and still our refined shrieks with some account of the harmless habits of this fabulous animal, and by tracing the strange and secret connection between it and the rashers on the breakfast table. If a thunderbolt or meteoric stone fell in front of us in the street, we might have more sympathy with the policeman who wanted to remove it from the thoroughfare than with the professor who wished to stand in the middle of the thoroughfare, lecturing on the constituent elements of the comet or nebula of which it was a flying fragment. But though the policeman might be justified in exclaiming, in the original Greek, "What are the Pleiades to me?" even he would admit that more information about the soil and strata of the Pleiades can be obtained from a professor than from a policeman. So if some strange and swollen monstrosity called a vegetable marrow surprises us like a thunderbolt, let us not imagine that it is so strange to the man who grows marrows as it is to us, merely because his field and work seems to be as far away as the Pleiades. Let us recognize that he is, after all, a specialist on these mysterious marrows and prehistoric pigs, and treat him like a learned man come from a foreign university. England is now such a long way off from London that its emissaries might at least be received with the respect due to distinguished visitors from China or the Cannibal Islands. But, anyhow, we need no longer talk of them as merely ignorant, in talking of the very thing of which we are ignorant ourselves. One man may think the peasant's knowledge irrelevant, as another may think the professor's irrelevant, but in both cases it is knowledge, for it is knowledge of the causes of things. Most of us realize in some sense that this is true, but many of us have not yet realized that the converse is also true. And it is that other truth, when we have understood it, that leads to the next necessary point about the full status of the peasant. And the point is this: that the peasant also will have but a partial experience if he grows things in the country solely in order to sell them in the town. Of course, it is only a joke to represent either the ignorance of town or country as being so grotesque as I have suggested for the sake of example. The townsman does not really think that milk is rained from the clouds, or that rashers grow on trees, even when he is a little vague about vegetable marrows. He knows something about it, but not enough to make his advice of much value. The rustic does not really think that milk is used as whitewash, or marrows as bolsters, even if he never actually sees them used. But if he is a mere producer, and not a consumer of them, his position does become as partial as that of any Cockney clerk, nearly as narrow, and even more servile. Given the wonderful romance of the vegetable marrow, it is a bad thing that the peasant should only know the beginning of the story, as it is a bad thing that the clerk should only know the end of it. I insert here this general suggestion for a particular reason. Before we come to the practical expediency of the peasant who consumes what he produces, and the reason for thinking it, as Mr. Heseltine has urged, much more practicable than the method by which he only sells what he produces, I think it well to point out that this course, while it is more expedient, is not a mere surrender to expediency. It seems to me a very good thing, in theory as well as practice, that there should be a body of citizens primarily concerned in producing and consuming, and not in exchanging. It seems to me a part of our ideal, and not merely a part of our compromise, that there should be in the community a sort of core of not only simplicity, but of completeness. Exchange and variation can then be given their reasonable place, as they were in the old world of fairs and markets. But there would be somewhere in the center of civilization a type that was truly independent, in the sense of producing and consuming within its own social circle. I do not say that such a complete human life stands for a complete humanity. I do not say that the state needs only the man who needs nothing from the state. But I do say that this man who supplies his own needs is very much needed. I say it largely because of his absence from modern civilization, that modern civilization has lost its unity. It is nobody's business to note the whole of a process, to see where things come from and where they go to. Nobody follows the whole winding course of the river of milk as it flows from the cow to the baby. Nobody who is in at the death of the pig is responsible for realizing that the proof of the pig is in the eating. Men throw marrows at other men like cannonballs, but they do not return to them like boomerangs. We need a social circle in which things constantly return to those that threw them, and men who know the end and the beginning in the rounding of our little life.